let us talk about the World Trade Organization. Because we're talking about trade, this organization is very important for us to talk about now. So this is the organization that regulates trade between countries and an international body dealing with the global rules of trade between unions. So, we are saying there is international trade, this country is trading with this one, but there is an organization responsible for that. So the WTO or the WTO regulates trade between countries. It was established in 1995 to replace the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT) of 1947. It is not a specialized organ of the United Nations, but has cooperation arrangements and works closely with the United Nations. So it is not part of the United Nations, but it only works closely with the United Nations. Functions of the WTO: to help trade flow as freely as possible by reducing and eventually eliminating trade taxes and other barriers imposed by various nations. There are some countries which impose tariffs. No, when you're importing from here, you need to pay these taxes. But with the help of the World Trade Organization, they reduce or eventually eliminate those taxes. Then to set out rules for regulating international trade. So the World Trade Organization is responsible for setting out rules that should regulate the international trade. No, you shouldn't trade within this period. No, this country shouldn't trade with this one. They are responsible for making the laws or the rules, let me say. To interpret trade agreements and impartially settle trade disputes between nations. Then to organize trade negotiations among its members. It organizes trade negotiations. So those are the functions of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization. Now, let us talk about the principles. It has got principles. Principle number 1, non-discrimination. This means that a country should not discriminate between its trading partners, or granted the war are granted the most favored nation. Or granted the war are granted the most favored nation status. So there is no discrimination to the WTO. No, this country will be favored, this country. They just stand on the truth. Even when they are setting out the rules, they won't favor any country. No, this is the developed country. We shouldn't set out a rule to hinder this from happening or to deceive this country. No, they will just set out the rules that they feel like these are good for the welfare of the world. Because we're talking about global issues here. Then 2, free trade. This implies that there should be free trade and all trade barriers should be reduced through negotiations. This is the second principle of the WTO. Free trade. Then predictability. This means that foreign companies, investors, and governments should be confident that tariffs and other trade barriers will not be raised arbitrarily. When you say I'm predicting, you are just anticipating something that has not yet happened. You are just anticipating. So foreign companies, investors, governments should be confident that tariffs and other trade barriers will not be raised arbitrarily. They won't come. That is predictability. Competition. This means that there should be more free competition in international trade, as unfair practices are not allowed. Free competition, no unfair practices. Special privileges for less developed countries, done by giving them more time to adjust to international rules of trade. Structure of the WTO. The WTO has 146 member countries and its headquarters are in Geneva, Swaziland. The WTO organs include the Council of Ministers of Commerce, who meet every 2 years, the General Council, which meets 6 times a year, sector councils, and several committees. This is the structure of the World Trade Organization. Weaknesses of the WTO. It has got some of the weaknesses. decisions made by the WTO are still strongly influenced and guided by the interests of developed countries such as the United States and the European Union countries. So they say they work with impartiality, free from biasness, but some of their decisions are strongly influenced and guided by the interests of developed countries. That means they are also controlled by these big countries like United States and the European Union countries. Then the WTO believes that decisions should be made democratically and be consensus. But in practice, less developed countries are often not given an equal platform to negotiate and defend their trade interests. Decisions should be made democratically, but less developed countries are not given equal platform to negotiate. They just negotiate with those developed countries, the big countries. So that is also a weakness of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization. We have talked about trade, which is the buying and selling of goods and services. Then we have also learned about the World Trade Organization, which is an organization responsible for regulating trade between different